We've got to talk about this big news around white South Africans being accepted into the United States as refugees. Because while Trump has halted virtually all refugee admissions for people fleeing famine and war in places like Sudan and the Congo, on Monday we saw him welcome 59 members of a white ethnic minority group from South Africa known as Afrikaners. Right, and they're the descendants of Dutch and other Europeans who went to South Africa centuries ago. They played a role in setting up the apartheid system in 1948, and now today, they and other white South Africans make up around 7% of the country's population while owning more than half of the country's commercial farmland, especially as much of that land was originally acquired by forcing out black farmers and herders. And in 1913, in fact, a law was actually passed explicitly allocating 93% of the country's land to white people. And now this week's news, it actually goes back to the current South African government's efforts to address this inequality through land reform. Because in January there, the president signed a controversial law that, in very rare circumstances, gives the government the ability to take private property without paying compensation, which then prompted Donald Trump to cut off all aid to South Africa and sign an executive order ordering his own administration to, quote, prioritize humanitarian relief, including admission and resettlement through the United States Refugee Admissions Program for Afrikaners in South Africa who are victims of unjust racial discrimination. With then some South African officials casting the move as politically motivated and noting that the Trump administration has criticized the country for having a close relationship with Iran and for its stance against Israel. And this is, you had others pointing out that several of the most influential figures around Trump are 50-something white men with formative experiences in apartheid South Africa. With that appearing to include not only Elon Musk, but also people like Peter Thiel, who's another Silicon Valley billionaire with deep ties to the administration. And actually, Musk has been one of the most prominent voices spreading claims about persecution and even genocide against white people and white farmers in particular in South Africa. And with that, on Monday, to justify the refugee program, we saw Trump repeating those claims.
It's a genocide that's taking place that you people don't want to write about, but it's a terrible thing that's taking place. And farmers are being killed. They happen to be white, but whether they're white or black makes no difference to me. But white farmers are being brutally killed, and their land is being confiscated in South Africa.
Now, notably, with that, you have many experts saying there's little to no evidence to back up those claims. But as far as confiscating land, there is a law that would allow for that to happen, and whether that's a good idea, that's up for debate, obviously. But the key thing with that is, at least so far, it hasn't actually been used to seize any land. Two, if the government does try to invoke the law, there are strict requirements that have to be met, and the whole process is subject to review by a judge. And three, another key purpose of the law is to deal with the dilapidated and abandoned structures throughout the country that pose a real safety risk, which actually is something we saw evidence of in 2023 when a huge fire killed at least 77 people, including children, squatting in an abandoned building. And then, as far as the other claims, right, the idea of a white genocide taking place, you have experts saying that there's really no basis for that whatsoever. And then even the idea that white farmers are being specifically targeted and killed on a widespread or regular basis, you have many saying, for sure, there have been murders that have made for shocking headlines. But the reality on the ground there is that it's an extremely dangerous country in general, and black South Africans are ultimately far more likely to be victims of violence. With this seeing Tessa Dooms, for example, an executive at a think tank in Johannesburg, saying that Trump's claims are based on lies, on false narratives, and propaganda that is purely fictional. And then with that, if you look at the numbers, last year, there were 72 murders a day in the country, right? That is per day, but over the year, only 44 murders were recorded on farms and smaller plots of agricultural land, and only 8 of those actually involved the death of a farmer. And while we don't know the race of all the victims, what we do know is that a majority of the country's farmers are white, while the other people living on the farms, like as laborers, for example, they're mostly black. And I mean, just looking at the last quarter of 2024, there were 12 farm murders recorded by the police, with only one of those people actually killed being a white farmer. And again, that's out of nearly 7,000 total killings in the country during that time. You know, with that, while there are obviously concerns about violence, we really haven't seen people trying to say that they were refugees. And, you know, last year, there were reportedly no South Africans of any race, ethnicity, or linguistic group who met the UN's criteria to be resettled as refugees. And now, State Department officials are reportedly being tight-lipped about exactly what boxes have been ticked off for these new arrivals. Though a departmental memo obtained by the Washington Post reportedly claimed that most of them have witnessed or experienced extreme violence with a racial nexus, including home invasions, murders, or carjackings that took place up to 25 years ago. And with that, you had one migration researcher claiming that the South Africans arriving in the US are aware that there's no persecution of white people in the country, but are taking advantage of the opportunity to go to America. With them then also saying to another outlet, it has very little to do with South Africa's empirical realities and everything to do with Trump positioning himself as a savior of white privilege and Christianity globally. And then ultimately, with all that, you have aid groups, activists, and others saying that Trump's refugee initiative, it makes a mockery of a system designed to help people who are truly in need. But especially as you're seeing these South Africans being helped not just in addition to others in need, but instead of. Because again, the Trump administration has suspended most refugee admissions and cut off funding to resettlement agencies in the country. It's also moved to rescind temporary protected status designations for countries including Haiti, Venezuela, and Cameroon, and opening the door for their deportation back to those countries. And in fact, on the same day that these South Africans arrived in the country, you had the Department of Homeland Security announcing that it would terminate temporary protected status for over 9,000 Afghans already in the US. And with that, you had DHS Secretary Kristi Noem saying Afghanistan has had an improved security situation and its stabilizing economy no longer prevent them from returning to their home country. Though there, you had many calling the idea that Afghan refugees can safely return to their Taliban-ruled homeland absurd and divorced from reality. And then on top of all this is as the South African refugees have been given preferential treatment in a number of ways. Because for one, the refugee process often takes years, but Trump created an expedited pathway that's gotten them into the country in just a matter of months. With him also saying that he'd put them on an easy path to citizenship. Plus, for decades, the State Department has required refugees to pay their own way to travel to the US, and when a refugee can't afford the cost to travel, the State Department provides the refugee with an interest-free repayable loan. With all of that being facilitated through a UN agency called the International Organization for Migration. But this time, what you're seeing is that the IOM hasn't actually been involved, and State Department officials have instead reportedly chartered a plane directly, which is a move that typically only occurs during emergencies involving a large number of people all being resettled at once, like when the Taliban returned to power in Afghanistan in 2021. And then finally, the administration is also reportedly putting a lot of effort into helping the new arrivals with resettlement, including finding housing and getting a hold of other essential goods and services. Though, I will say with that, notably, since Trump has frozen a lot of funding going to the organizations that help resettlement, officials are reportedly pulling the money from other sources. One meant to cover gaps in funding for particularly vulnerable refugees, and another to help state governments administer job training and other programs for refugees. And notably, one of the non-governmental organizations that the federal government was still funding, the Episcopal Church, it has actually refused its directive from the administration to help resettle the South African refugees, citing the church's long-standing commitment to racial justice and reconciliation. With the church then also announcing that by the end of the federal fiscal year, it would completely conclude its refugee resettlement grant agreements with the US federal government. A move that marks the end of a ministry-government partnership that has for over 4 decades served over nearly 110,000 refugees from all around the world. And so ultimately, however you feel about the refugees from South Africa, which, I'd love to know your thoughts in those comments, one thing for sure is that a lot fewer people in need are going to be getting help. Hey, thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this clip from the full Philip DeFranco show. And also, a big thanks to Squarespace for sponsoring our Clips channel. Turn your passion into profit over at squarespace.com/Phil or use the QR code. Because whether you're launching a business or a lucrative side hustle, your website is your digital business card. It's the only space where you control the story, no algorithms or distractions. And with Squarespace, it's so easy because they got a ton of stunning professional templates with drag and drop editing that makes site design incredibly simple, no coding required. So get started for free at squarespace.com/Phil or scan the QR code on screen and use code Phil for 10% off when ready to launch. Squarespace.com/Phil.